I'm Adeline Stratton, a risk underwriter who spends 40 hours a week calculating the exact cost of a disaster. Yet I never expected the catastrophic failure to be sitting right across from me at my own mahogany dining table. My husband, Sterling Whitaker, flashed that million-dollar smile of his while pouring a vintage Cabernet, looking every bit like the successful construction manager the world believed him to be. "You look exhausted. Addie, why don't you just sign those supplemental insurance forms for the firm and let me handle the stress?" he suggested, his voice as smooth as the silk tie I bought him for his promotion. I leaned down to retrieve a fallen napkin and noticed a stray yellow sticky note stuck to the underside of the table, featuring his erratic handwriting. It read, "Just get her to sign the mortgage rider, and Celine can list the property by Monday." The air in the room turned to ice as the realization hit me that my own husband was plotting a $1,200,000 heist against my sanity. I sat back up, keeping my face a mask of professional indifference, the kind I use to deny high-risk claims at the office. "Is that so, Sterling? Because this rider looks less like a corporate necessity and more like a fast track to liquidation," I said, swirling my wine while watching the color drain from his face. He chuckled nervously, reaching for my hand across the table. But I pulled away to adjust my watch. "Don't be paranoid, honey. It's just a standard liability shift for the new project," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the hallway where my sister Celine's designer heels were clicking against the hardwood. Adeline Stratton strolled in with the practiced ease of a top-tier real estate agent, smelling of expensive perfume and betrayal. "Oh, is she still being difficult about the paperwork? Adeline, honestly, your lack of trust is becoming a real drag on the family's portfolio," she chirped, leaning over Sterling's shoulder in a way that was far too familiar for a sister-in-law. I looked at her, noting the $85,000 diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist that I knew for a fact she couldn't afford on her current commissions. "My lack of trust is exactly what keeps this family from living in a cardboard box. Celine, so tell me, does Sterling's cologne smell better when you're helping him forge my signature?" I asked, my voice cutting through their pretense like a scalpel. They both froze, the silence in the penthouse heavy enough to suffocate, until Sterling finally broke it with a scoff. "You're delusional, Adeline. And if you don't sign these papers, your father's business is going to crater under the new debt," he threatened, finally dropping the charming facade. I stood up, smoothing my skirt and grabbing my phone, which had been recording the entire exchange from the moment I found that note. "Then let it crater. Because I'm not subsidizing your affair or your amateur hour fraud anymore," I replied, heading for the door. I knew I had just lit a fuse on a $2 million bomb. And as I walked away, I couldn't wait to watch their perfect little world burn to the ground. The heavy scent of roasted lamb filled my parents' dining room, but the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of rot. My father, Harrison Stratton, slammed his fist on the table so hard the silverware rattled against the china. "Adeline, stop being so damn difficult and just sign the authorization for the family fund distribution," he barked, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. I set my fork down slowly, glancing at my mother, Janet, who was too busy smoothing Celine's hair to even look me in the eye. "You want me to authorize a $500,000 withdrawal for a family fund that hasn't seen a deposit from anyone but me in 3 years?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, rhythmic precision. Celine let out a staged, trembling sigh, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk napkin. "It's for the business, Addie. I told you I'm on the verge of a massive closing and I just need a bridge loan to cover the overhead," she whimpered, though the sparkle in her eyes was pure greed. I leaned back, a sarcastic smirk playing on my lips as I tapped my fingernails against the crystal glass. "Funny, Celine. Because your overhead looks suspiciously like that new $85,000 Porsche sitting in the driveway, I countered, watching her flinch as Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat next to her. Janet finally spoke up, her voice trembling with a forced maternal indignation. How can you be so transactional with your own blood? Adeline, your sister is struggling, and you're counting pennies like a common clerk. I laughed. A sharp, hollow sound that cut through her guilt-tripping like a serrated blade. I'm not counting pennies. Janet, I'm counting the $1,200,000 you all tried to skim off my mortgage rider this morning, I stated, my gaze locking onto Harrison's startled eyes. He stood up, towering over the table in a desperate attempt to regain control. You're an ungrateful, cold-hearted brat who cares more about a balance sheet than your own kin, he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the door. I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled a folder from my bag and slid a bank statement across the linen tablecloth. Being cold-hearted is a survival mechanism when your parents treat you like an ATM for their favorite failure, I snapped, watching them scramble to cover the documents. Sterling tried to place a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged him off with a look of pure disgust. Let's go. Sterling. She's clearly in one of her moods and won't listen to reason, Celine muttered, grabbing her designer bag and pulling him toward the foyer. Harrison glared at me, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. If you don't sign these papers by tomorrow, you are dead to this family. Do you hear me? I stood up, adjusting my coat with a calm, terrifying serenity. Being dead to you sounds like a very lucrative life insurance policy for me. Harrison, I replied, walking out into the crisp night air without looking back. I knew they were desperate, but they had no idea that I was just getting started. Sterling burst into my office 3 days later, leaning on a pair of crutches with a dramatic wince that wouldn't have fooled a first-year insurance adjuster. Addie. There was a catastrophic collapse at the downtown site, and since the company's liability is capped, they're coming after our personal assets for $300,000. He groaned, dropping a stack of blurry photos onto my desk. I didn't even look at the pictures, keeping my eyes on my dual monitors as I finished a risk assessment for a much more competent client. A collapse at a site that had a stop work order issued last Tuesday? Sterling, your commitment to this performance is almost impressive, I remarked, finally spinning my chair to face his poorly acted agony. He stammered, his grip tightening on the crutches as he realized I wasn't reaching for my checkbook. It was an emergency repair, and if we don't pay the settlement by Friday, the creditors will put a lien on every account we have, he shouted, the desperation in his voice finally sounding genuine. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my laced fingers with a predatory stillness. Then let them try. Because I moved my personal holdings into a private trust 2 hours after you finished your little dinner theater at my parents' house, I informed him, watching his jaw drop in a satisfying display of shock. Celine called me 10 minutes after Sterling limped out, her voice a shrill weapon of social sabotage. I've already spoken to the board at the Real Estate Association, Adeline, and by the time I'm done, no firm in Manhattan will touch your underwriting contracts, she hissed, the sound of her expensive car's engine idling in the background. I smiled at the receiver, knowing my recording software was capturing every word of her attempted extortion. Blackmail is such a messy career choice for someone with so much unpaid credit card debt. Celine. So tell me, does the association know you're using client escrow to pay for your $85,000 Porsche? I asked, enjoying the dead silence that followed. She hung up. But the game was far from over as I pulled up Sterling's corporate tax filings on my screen. I noticed a series of irregular payments to a shell company that shared a billing address with Celine's boutique agency. You two are so predictable it's almost boring, I whispered to the empty room. flagging the $300,000 discrepancy for a formal audit. I wasn't just defending my assets anymore. I was building a cage for the people who thought I was their prey. Harrison and Janet tried to intervene through a series of venomous emails, claiming my refusal to help was a violation of family honor. I deleted them without reading, focusing instead on the subpoena I was preparing for the bank records they thought were hidden. Honor doesn't pay for fraud. Harrison. But a good underwriter always knows when to settle. I muttered, hitting the send button on an encrypted file to my attorney. The walls were closing in on them, and they were too blinded by their own greed to see the trap I had set. I met Mr. Storr, Garrick, in a dimly lit corner of a mahogany-clad bar, where the veteran attorney slid a dusty manila folder across the scarred wood. Adeline, your grandmother's trust was ironclad, but it wasn't immune to a forged signature from someone she trusted, he whispered, his eyes weary behind gold-rimmed spectacles. I opened the file to find a series of withdrawal slips, totaling $1,500,000, each bearing a shaky imitation of my handwriting dated 3 years ago. So, Harrison and Janet didn't just drain my inheritance, they turned my identity into a fraudulent slush fund for Celine's lifestyle. I concluded, the cold fury in my chest crystallizing into a tactical plan. I summoned my parents to Mr. Garrick's office the following morning, relishing the way Janet clutched her designer handbag as if it could protect her from the truth. We did what we had to do to keep the family name intact when Celine's first brokerage failed. Adeline. And you were always the successful one who didn't need the money, Janet argued, her voice trembling with a hideous, forced logic. I tapped the $1,500,000 ledger on the desk, the sound echoing like a gavel in the sterile room. You didn't protect the family name. Janet, you committed felony grand larceny against your own daughter to subsidize a thief, I replied, watching Harrison's face turn an ashen gray as he realized Mr. Garrick was taking notes. Harrison lunged forward, his voice a desperate, guttural growl that betrayed his fear. You wouldn't actually put your own father in prison over a technicality regarding a fund that would have been yours anyway. Would you? He demanded, his hands shaking as he reached for the documents. I pulled the folder back, out of his reach, with a slow and deliberate grace. It isn't a technicality when you steal $1,500,000 and leave me to pay the taxes on a ghost account. Harrison, I countered, leaning in until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. Janet began to sob, but the sound felt as hollow as the trust she had shattered. We can pay it back. We just need a few more months to flip the new property Celine is listing, she pleaded, reaching out to touch my arm. I stood up, adjusting my blazer and signaling to Mr. Garrick that we were finished. You don't have months, because by noon, the bank will be freezing every asset you have left for an internal fraud investigation, I informed them, my voice devoid of any familial warmth. Harrison collapsed back into his chair, the weight of a lifetime of deception finally crushing his posture. You're destroying us. Adeline, he choked out. But I was already halfway to the door. No, Harrison. I'm just auditing the mess you created, I said, walking out into the sunlit hall with the weight of their secrets finally off my shoulders. The ballroom was a sea of champagne and vanity as Adeline Stratton took the stage, glowing under the spotlight during her Real Estate Agent of the Year gala. I couldn't have achieved this $20 million sales milestone without the unwavering support of my family and my incredible partner, Sterling. She beamed, gesturing toward my husband who stood tall in the front row. I stepped into the light from the wings, signaled the AV technician, and watched the massive LED screen behind her flicker to life. Actually, Celine, the room would much rather hear about the support you stole from my $1,500,000 trust fund, I announced into my wireless mic, the room falling into a deafening, vacuum-like silence. The screen didn't show property listings. It played the crystal-clear recording of Sterling and Celine in my penthouse, plotting to forge my signature on the mortgage rider. Adeline. Turn that off right now. You're having a mental breakdown, Sterling screamed, lunging toward the stage as the guests gasped at the footage of him kissing my sister. I stood my ground, my voice amplified and unshakable. A breakdown? No. Sterling. I'm just providing the transparency your investors deserve before they realize you've been laundering their deposits through Celine's boutique agency. I countered, watching his face turn a sickly shade of gray. Celine dropped her glass, the champagne shattering against her designer heels as she stared at the screen showing her $85,000 Porsche purchase records linked to my stolen funds. This is private family business. You're ruining my career over a petty misunderstanding, she shrieked, her carefully curated influencer image evaporating in seconds. I walked right up to her, noting the panicked stares of the Manhattan elite who were already pulling out their phones to record the fall of the Strattons. Your career was built on $1,500,000 of grand larceny and my husband's betrayal. Celine. So consider this your final listing. It's called a criminal indictment, I whispered, the mic catching every venomous word. Sterling grabbed my arm, his grip bruising as he tried to drag me away. But I leaned into his ear with a freezing laugh. Don't touch me, Sterling, because the police are already in the lobby waiting to discuss that $300,000 faked construction accident with you, I warned, shaking him off with a look of pure contempt. Janet and Harrison stood in the back, frozen like statues as the crowd began to hiss and whisper, their family honor burning in the center of the room. You've humiliated us in front of everyone. Adeline. How could you be so cruel? Janet wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of social ruin. I adjusted my necklace and looked her dead in the eye. Cruelty is stealing a daughter's future. I'm just giving you the public recognition you worked so hard to earn, I replied, walking out of the ballroom as the first sirens began to wail outside. Sterling sat across the deposition table, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling as he stared at the financial audit I had triggered. Adeline, if you don't drop the federal fraud complaint, I'm going to lose my license and face 10 years for that $300,000 insurance claim, he pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperation that tasted like victory. I leaned back, tapping my pen against the $500,000 tax lien document I had just diverted from my personal accounts back onto his corporate entity. A license you used to forge my signature and a career built on systemic theft? Sterling. You aren't a victim of my legal strategy. You're a victim of your own balance sheet, I replied, sliding the final divorce settlement toward him with a chilling finality. Celine marched into the room, her designer suit wrinkled and her eyes wild with the realization that the IRS had frozen her $85,000 Porsche and all her commission accounts. You think you've won because you have a fancy title. But I'll sue you for defamation and take every penny you have left, she screamed, slamming her palms onto the glass table. I didn't even blink, merely gesturing for Mr. Garrick to hand me the folder containing her boutique agency's offshore wire transfers. Defamation requires a lie. Celine. But these wire transfers show you moving $1,500,000 of my stolen trust fund into Sterling's shell company, which is a textbook case of money laundering, I stated, watching her knees buckle as she realized the room was full of recording devices. Harrison and Janet appeared in the doorway, their faces pale and gaunt as they clutched the foreclosure notice for the family estate. Adeline. Please. We're your parents. You can't let them take the house over a misunderstanding about the trust fund, Harrison begged, his once booming voice reduced to a pathetic whimper. I looked at the man who had stolen my future to fund his favorite daughter's greed and felt nothing but a cold, Sterile indifference. It wasn't a misunderstanding when you signed my name on 18 different withdrawal slips to hide Celine's $500,000 debt from the creditors. Harrison. I countered, the weight of his betrayal fueling my resolve. Janet reached out to touch my hand, her eyes swimming with manipulative tears that had worked on me for 30 years. But I pulled away before she could make contact. We're family. Addie. Surely we can find a way to settle this without involve the district attorney, she whispered, her voice a desperate attempt to appeal to a heart she had already broken. I stood up, signaled to the bailiff, and adjusted my blazer with a sharp, crisp movements. Family doesn't commit grand larceny against their own blood. Janet, family protects one another. And I am finally protecting myself from you, I declared, walking past them as the legal team began the final proceedings. Sterling lunged forward one last time, shouting that I was a monster for destroying the only life he knew. But the security guards quickly restrained him. I'm not destroying your life, Sterling. I'm just auditing it. And it turns out you're completely bankrupt in every way that matters, I said, looking back over my shoulder for the very last time. The checkmate was complete. The $2 million in assets were secured. And the people who tried to bury me were now drowning in the very depth of their own deceit. The legal dust finally settled, leaving a trail of wreckage that no amount of insurance could cover. Sterling Whitaker was led away in handcuffs, his construction career buried under a mountain of felony fraud charges and a $500,000 tax debt he could never repay. You think you're free, Adeline. But you'll always be the woman who destroyed her own husband, he screamed as the cruiser door slammed shut. I stood on the courthouse steps, adjusting my sunglasses against the harsh Manhattan sun, feeling nothing but the clean, sharp edge of closure. I didn't destroy you, Sterling. I just stopped lying for you, I whispered to the wind, watching the man I once loved disappear into the system. Adeline Stratton fared no better. Her real estate license revoked, and her social standing annihilated by the $1,500,000 money laundering scandal. I found her outside her foreclosed apartment, clutching a cardboard box of cheap trinkets, while her $85,000 Porsche was being towed away by the state. I have nothing left, Addie. No job. No money. And even my followers are mocking me online, she sobbed, looking like a ghost of the influencer she used to be. I didn't offer her a hand or a cent, knowing any mercy would only fuel her next parasitic scheme. At least now your outside matches your inside. Celine completely empty, I remarked, walking past her without a second glance. The final blow fell on Harrison and Janet, whose family honor had been liquidated to satisfy the $1,200,000 in restitution. The court ordered them to pay back to my trust fund. They moved into a cramped, one-bedroom rental in a run-down part of the city, their days of luxury replaced by the cold reality of Social Security checks. We were just trying to keep the family together. Adeline. You can't truly mean to leave your own parents in this dump, Janet wailed when I dropped off the final legal papers. I looked around the peeling wallpaper and the stained carpet, seeing the physical manifestation of their moral bankruptcy. Family isn't a transaction, Janet. And I've officially closed the account, I replied, leaving them to the silence of the life they had built on lies. I spent the evening in my new penthouse, a space filled with sunlight and devoid of toxic secrets. The $2 million in assets I had reclaimed sat securely in a trust they could never touch. But the real wealth was the silence. I realized then that my worth was never something they could grant or take away. It was something I had to audit for myself. Standing on the balcony, I watched the city lights flicker like a million possibilities, knowing that for the first time in 30 years, I was truly, irrevocably debt-free. I sat by the window of my quiet study, watching the rain wash away the grime of the city streets. The $2 million was safe. But the true healing came from the absolute silence of my phone. You finally learned that some risks aren't worth the premium. Addie. I whispered to the empty room. I am no longer a victim or an underwriter of other people's greed. I am simply free. Thank you for following my journey through the wreckage of the Rutherford legacy. Betrayal can shatter your world. But your intelligence is the only tool that can truly rebuild it. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to save your own future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.